Welcome, everybody, to Geeking Poetic Podcast Channel. I'm one of your hosts, Larry Roberts. This finely bearded man over here to my right and your left is my co-host, none other than
Mr. Matt Valuckis, rocking that winter beard because it is fiercely cold out here.
It is stupidly cold. But we made it. We are shivering down here in the studio just to entertain all of you out there.
At the GPC, Geeking Poetic Central.
It is.
Patent pending.
All right. So, Matt, what are we here to talk about today, man? We're not talking about toys.
No.
We're not talking about sci-fi.
No.
We're not talking about action adventure. We're
No.
not talking about rom-coms. None of that stuff today. What are we talking about?
We ain't talking about love.
We ain't talking about love, although we might be talking a little bit about some love.
A little bit. We're going to be talking about the Roth era Van Halen albums today.
Yes, exactly.
We have 7 to go through. Most people think about the 6. They don't usually think about the reunion one that came out in 2012, but we're making sure that's on our list too, because it is Roth era Van Halen.
Yeah, exactly. We're not just going to cover the classic era. We're going to get into that reunion album, which I am very eager to talk about.
Indeed.
Actually.
And it's funny because as we talked about this, we were talking about ranking the albums, and the reunion album had completely slipped my mind. Like it wasn't even on my radar until you mentioned, make sure you get that one. I'm like, oh, that's right. They did do the 2012 album. And like I said, I completely forgot about it.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people do, and that's why it's important that we include it in here for a whole bunch of reasons, aside from what we think of it. But, it does tie in to early Van Halen for a bunch of reasons. But we will get to that when we talk about that album. So what we're going to do this a little bit differently than a lot of the ranking videos that you've seen us do, as well as other channels. We're not going to go from 7 to 1 or 1 to 7. What we're going to do is we're going to address them chronologically. We're going to start with the first album here and then work our way up to A Different Kind of Truth from 2012. And as we go through each one, we're going to let everybody know where we rank it. And you'll have little graphics on the screen that's going to show you mine and Matthew's ranking lists. So without any further ado, let me get into, for those, I can't imagine who would be watching or listening to this that doesn't know about Van Halen.
At least the name Van Halen. Yeah. But there's background to them, as there is background with any band. And why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, okay. So the Van Halen brothers, Edward and Alex, they were born many moons ago. But they were born in Amsterdam, Holland, to parents that were of Dutch and Indonesian descent, and a lot of music in the house. Their dad was a professional musician. He got them started on piano lessons when they were very young. And then
when did they move to the U.S.?
They moved to the U.S., I think it was like around 1962, early 1960s. They moved to California. California is the place you ought to be. So they moved there, and ironically, Eddie actually was the one that started out on drums. And Alex kind of was messing with everything. He was playing a little guitar, he was playing a little drums, and then Eddie quickly realized that Alex was much, much better on drums than Eddie was, you know.
And I always wonder how that conversation goes. Like, was Alex that much better and he's like, screw this, I'm going to do something else? Or was he like, no, Alex has this covered, and if he's doing it really well, I'm going to pick up something else and be kick-ass on that instead.
Right. I've never gotten any kind of clarity from reading things on how that part of it went. But
they're so competitive, those brothers. Like, it just makes me wonder.
Yeah, well, but I mean, talk about two guys that are just such absolute masters of their respective crafts. I mean, I think Eddie probably got pretty quickly drawn to guitar because, boy, talk about like a fish taken to water. Man.
Yeah.
It's Eddie Van Halen. He's just one of the absolute all-time greats. So inevitably they did various bands, but Van Halen, the band, officially really formed in 1972. By 1974, they got the core lineup of what we now consider to be classic Van Halen, which was Michael Anthony on bass and David Lee Roth on vocals and yelps and all his other and roundhouse kicks and all his other antics.
Nobody did a roundhouse kick better than David Lee Roth in the early 80s.
That man was limber. Mm-hmm. He still is. You watch videos from him from recent years, and I mean, he's still that. He's the man. But anyway,
he's got drop dead legs.
He does. He does. Boy, you're just going to be all about. I mean, they were really, really, really well known and respected around the whole Southern California, the West Coast scene in general. They played pretty much every club and every backyard party you can imagine between 72 and 77. They even had little dalliances where Gene Simmons from Kiss tried to get them signed, but that's a whole book unto itself that you can look up and find out more about that. That ended up not happening, but ultimately what did happen was producer Ted Templeman discovered them, got them signed to Warner Brothers, and voila, here we go. By February 10th, I think it was, February 10th, 1978, we get Van Halen, or Van Halen 1, as some people call it, but it's really just called Van Halen. This album did come out on February 10th, 1978. It peaked on the Billboard charts at number 18. So it was not bad for a debut album, man. It made top 20, but, this wasn't no top 5 hit or anything like people might think. Inevitably, this thing sold over 10 million copies in the United States alone. We're not even talking about worldwide. I can't even imagine what the numbers are worldwide, but this is a biggie. This was the face that launched a million ships, so to speak. I mean, this was it. It had from the beginning. I mean, just looking at the set list, "Running with the Devil," is the first song. That's a biggie. The second song on the album is "Eruption,"
right?
"Eruption," which completely redefined guitar playing.
Yes.
All sorts of great songs. Ain't Talking About Love, I'm the One, Jamie's Crying, Feel Your Love Tonight, On Fire, which is probably my favorite song on the album. And then, of course, Van Halen was always known for their cover songs. It's got the requisite couple of covers. It's got their famous version of You Really Got Me. And then it's got Ice Cream Man, which is kind of
an old blues tune, yeah.
Yeah, it's a blues tune, and it's kind of a fan favorite, I think. It wasn't like it didn't burn up the charts or anything like that, but now it's considered an absolute classic. Man, this is a great album, but I really would love to know your thoughts on this album.
So for me, in general, Van Halen, when I first was introduced to them, it was so very different. So I've got that take of what it was like being that 12, 14-year-old kid 10-year-old kid who had, learned about them the first time. And then when we were tasked with kind of going back and listening to all these albums for the purpose of reviewing them, it was a very different ear when I came back to them.
Sure.
And one of the things that, as I was listening to now, and it's something, if you listen to any of Eddie's playing, there's so much phase on his guitar. It's the phase, it's the distortion that nobody else at that time was really doing, not to the scope that he was. He kind of made that phase of that distorted guitar and the playing of it.
The MXR, the Phase 90 and Eddie Van Halen are just synonymous.
Yeah, they're synonymous with each other. So, I mean, but you listen to that and that tone that he had on a guitar, especially like knowing that this came out in 1978, which seems forever ago now that we're in the 2020s.
Right.
But, when I first was listening to this in the early 80s, 78 obviously wasn't that far, but you listen to everything else that was coming out by then, and you had, Kiss was doing a lot of the hard rock and the kick-ass stuff. But in my mind, as that kid, there weren't a whole lot of other bands that were doing something like this.
Right.
This was the birth of so many things, of hair metal, of glam metal, of, having a little bit of humor back in the music. Like a lot of these early albums, David Lee Roth had that kitschiness about him, but it never felt kitschy. Right. And that's what I always loved about it. But again, my first introduction was Eruption into You Really Got Me. And,
Right.
you know, growing up on the 60s stuff that my dad used to listen to, 50s and 60s, I knew that song like the back of my hand. And here was this rocked up version that was like one of the songs that I loved with all of my heart that was done in this new kick-ass guitar dirty way, and it was fantastic. So for me, those were really big standouts.
Right.
And you're talking about Love, the riff on that starts that song. It's iconic
Classic.
to me. Like
yeah,
you hear that, and you're like, you know, it's got that energy to it from the get go. It's awesome. And then on the back end of the album, you know, for me, I'm the One.
Man, such a good song.
You know, that's great. That acapella doo-wop. You've got this band that is up here and they're rocking and they're, you know, the fan kicks and, you know, distorted guitar, but then here they're jumping into an acapella song, and it's not clean acapella. I mean, you can listen to it, you can hear that they're off beat, they're off tune a little bit here and there, but
it's got swagger.
Like the energy in that just owns it. And like the same thing with Ice Cream Man. You start with this acoustic, like you can tell it's slightly like out of tune, and it's just this old bluesy, kind of have some fun with it. And then you get to that first hit with the drum kicks and the distorted guitar that just flips a switch like that. To me, it was like nothing else that I had heard of before this.
I agree, and I think that what's interesting is that there's a lot of other bands that they have their first couple albums. They're great albums, like they may even be classics, but there's a lot of bands that you could say, well, they didn't really get their defining sound until later. I mean, even a band, people might argue with me about this, but you can look at bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. First albums are absolute classics, but you can sit there and go, well, but there's still a little bit of a primitiveness with the, you know, you listen to that First Sabbath, First Zeppelin album, it's still just really rooted in blues and, you know, not really that adventurous yet. Then you get to albums like, you know, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, or you get to Led Zeppelin 4 with Stairway to Heaven, and then you go, okay, now this is it. This is the definitive thing, but it took a while. Van Halen defined themselves and let everybody know what they were in for with this first album. You got all that diversity like you talked about. You had everything from doo-wop to 60s rock to something modern that people had never heard before. I mean, again, even talking, like you said, all the influence that this band had. You listen to something like On Fire, and I mean, like there's influence there that you can draw a straight line between On Fire and Pantera. You know, something that came 20 years later almost, you know, it's like, 15 years later, whatever it was. Like, even like thrash metal and heavy stuff, like this just started everything. Now, here's where it's going to get controversial. That being said, for me, people might sit there and go, well, that's got to be your number one Van Halen album. It's not. It's not my number one Van Halen album, and there's a couple of reasons for it. For one thing, even though I was aware of this album at a pretty young age, I mean, this album came out when I was 5 years old, so I wasn't listening to Van Halen yet. It wasn't much later, but so I found this album retroactively, and by the time I heard this album, I had already heard Van Halen 2, I'd heard Women and Children First, I'd heard Fair Warning. And so with that, it didn't have that same kind of initial impact on me, which I'm sure affects the way I rank this album. I love this album. I have to say that any one of these, I probably should have said this at the start of the program, but I'll just say it now. There is no such thing as a bad Van Halen album to me. Every one of them is great. So this is just a matter of like, what one am I going to like listen to the most frequently? What one had the biggest impact on me when I heard it? What one is
what were you listening to in that formative time when like it locked into a core memory or something like that?
Right. Yeah. It's going to be all those kind of factors. And so as such, this album, as great as it isn't that album for me. No. So, and plus, unfortunately, because this album, I guess I should hold it against it, but because this album is so iconic and everything, some of these songs, you know, it's like, man, Running with the Devil's a great song. Ain't Talking About Love is a great song. Jamie's Crying is a great song. But oh my God, I've heard those songs so many times. You know, you any given time on Chicago radio, you turn on on one of the rock stations, and you're gonna, within a half an hour, you're gonna hear one of those songs. So it does take a little bit of a backseat to certain other ones. So for me, and we'll throw it up there on the chart, you'll see on the screen, for me, this album sits in the lower middle. It's number 3.
Same. Number 3, yeah, number 3 on this one, yeah,
awesome. See, because we didn't
talk about any of this stuff beforehand specifically for that reason,
right?
But yeah, and for the exact same reasons that you had mentioned, it was discovering this one later on because of, again, I'm 47, you just turned 50,
right?
But I was born in 76. So by the time that I really discovered music, I was about 7 or 8. And, at that point that was literally 1984 time. So to go back to 78 to learn about this, there were so many other albums that had formed my consciousness that coming back to this one, it didn't have that same impact because of when I was introduced to it.
Right. And we can totally acknowledge, we know enough and can totally acknowledge how incredible and impactful this album is and was, but it just didn't have that. We'd already been impacted by other things, and so that's why it sits where it does. Moving on.
Van Halen 2, aptly named because it was the second album.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So Van Halen 2. Now, this album was released on March 23rd, 1979. It peaked on the Billboard 200 charts at number 6. So it was a big leap from the last album that just barely made it into the top 20. Now we're just scratching at the top 5. So that was a big peak. However, it did sell less copies than the first album. This one only sold sold over 6 million. And again, we're just talking about US numbers, right? I don't have the international numbers. That's really hard to track. So, this is an album, it doesn't have the commercial appeal that the first album does. It doesn't have quite the what you might call like the widespread awareness of a lot of these songs of the public, but god damn, I love this album, man. This album just has everything that Edward did on that first album. I feel like he did just a little bit better on this album. Like there were definite, you can go back and listen to that first album and you can hear certain things where you're like, oh, I knowing Eddie, and if you heard him play some of those songs later, you can go, oh yeah, he improved on this, or certain things got a little bit better. I think even some of the lyric writing got better and everything. Well,
one of the things that's interesting to me about that, like if you go through these lists, every album, they were essentially released 1 year after the previous one.
It's incredible.
So it was literally, like the first one was February of 78. This one was March of 79. Women and Children First was March of 1980. It was literally, bands, the record industry is not like that anymore.
No.
3 to 7 years in between albums. And when you think about 6 albums that came out within 6 years of each other, literally, calendar you could mark it, that each spring you were going to get a new Van Halen album, that to me is astronomical. And
yes.
So this, much like any album from Van Halen, has a cover on it, and it's You're No Good.
Right.
Most people know the Linda Ronstadt version
right.
of that. That's more the iconic song. And as I was going through and looking at all these, I'm like, oh, you're rocking out a whole album, 10 fucking songs a year. That's also like you're doing press junkets. You are filming your videos. You are doing tours and concerts where you can. But then you're trying to find the time to write these songs, let alone record them and put it all together in a year is insane. So like to your point of like they improved upon these songs over time. Yeah, these came out so quickly that I don't think that they really had the time to polish the way they would have wanted to. Like listen to like probably. Eddie doing what he's doing. Like he's evolved over years and years and years of playing these. The other thing that really stood out to me is one of the things I love about Van Halen is their love of the cover songs. There's at least one on just about every album.
At least.
But when you think about that, if you have to write 10 songs per year, let's throw a couple of covers in there and make them our own. Take a little pressure off of ourselves to do that.
And let me interject just real quick and say that that's the key part, too, is that they made them their own. Mm-hmm. I mean, you listen to, like, You're No Good, or you listen to You Really Got Me. I mean, their versions, it's not that they're a million miles away from the original, but what they did to it made them Van Halen songs.
They put their stamp on it. They took They basically took those covers and said, what if we had written those songs?
Yes,
and
exactly.
played them that way. But for me, like even the songs that are on here, it's really Dance the Night Away and Beautiful Girls. Those are the two that you're going to hear like on your standard classic rock
those
stations.
Those are the big songs.
The two. The rest of them, Dance, You're No Good, again, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Bottoms Up, Out of Love Again, Light Up the Sky, Spanish Fly, a great instrumental tune. Yeah. It was like one of those, like, it was such a deviation from Eruption. It was great. DOA, Women in Love. For me, I'm gonna put my score out there early. This was my second lowest at number 6.
Wow.
And I think a lot of it is because the same thing. Like for me, it was right around their mid-album release when I really got to know Van Halen. So coming back into them and rediscovering like those first 3 albums, this one, it didn't have enough of that latch on me emotionally or anything to say this is a great fucking album. It is, but it didn't tug on my emotions the way that the other ones do.
Fair enough. I can totally see that. I've heard a lot of other people say that. This is such an interesting album because I think this one, maybe along with Fair Warning, this one seems to be one that I find the most division on amongst fans. I find fans that either say this is the best thing that era ever did, or I find fans that say, oh, it's the album that came between Van Halen 1 and Women and Children First. Like it was just transitory, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Transitional.
It got us there.
Yeah, it kind of got us there. I am in the former category. This is my number 1 favorite Van Halen album. It wasn't always. I have to admit, this was not always my favorite album. This has been, like so many of my favorite albums, this has been one of those ones that ended up really growing on me over the years. And as I got older and older, this album is the one that I kept coming back to. Somebody Get Me a Doctor's great. DOA, that riff in DOA is so fucking snaky and gritty. But it's got what is in my top 3 favorite Van Halen songs of all time. It's got Light Up the Sky. That song, I mean, I even stole a part of that song for a November's Doom song, actually. I'll point it out to you later. It's just incredible. The whole side 1 is really, really excellent. Side 2 of this album is one of the best side 2s of any album that I like.
Let's talk about that for a second too.
Yeah.
This is in the era of vinyl and cassettes where there was a side 1 and a side 2.
Right.
And oftentimes side 1 had a very different feel than side 2 or vice versa, where you could kind of play this story of how each side would go. And I think a lot of that is lost in modern music. So I think that's really important to say, because as we talk at some of the other albums, there's a side 2 that I absolutely love off of 1, but a side 1 that just blows me away from another album.
Oh, agreed. I mean, we're kind of blowing through these here tonight, so this isn't like 2 hours long, but honestly, you got to say, like, I could sit there and really break this down and go, what has the best side 1 and the best side 2, and what would be a perfect Van Halen playlist.
We could teach a college class on this. We really needed to.
Absolutely. Yeah. This and so many other bands I know we love. But so for you, this is number 6.
Yep. And for you, number 1.
And for me, this is actually number 1. Yeah. I got to say, again, the top 1, 2, 3 maybe of these, depending on my mood, they could kind of be interchangeable. Some weeks I might say, no, it's going to be this one. But I feel pretty good about this. I gotta say, this is the album. This is the one that I would hand any aspiring guitar player and be like, listen to this. Really listen to this. Not just the shredding, but the songwriting and the heaviness and everything.
So for Larry, number 2 is number 1.
All right, moving on.
We have Women and Children First.
Oh, man. What an album.
There's a lot to say about this album.
Yeah. Well, here, let me go through the stats first. So Women and Children First, this was released on March 26, 1980. So like you said earlier, just merely a year later. It's only been a couple years, and now we're already on our 3rd Van Halen album.
Peaked at the same place that Van Halen 2 did, number 6.
Yes, exactly. But again, and something we'll address as we go, interestingly, this album then sold even less than the previous album, which had sold less than the first album. This album only sold over 3 million copies, so cut in half. Each time we're cutting it almost in half. We went from 10 million to 6,
now to
6 to 3. And it's interesting. It's indicative of the times. We're going into the 1980s now, and every time we go into a new decade, there's always like a weird period of a couple of years where it kind of everybody sort of figures out who's going to be happening and what's
and it always seems
on.
like the third year in, there's kind of that lock on what the new sound is going to be for that generation.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happened in the 1980s, because by 83, that's when you had like the first metal bands getting really big, like Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, Rat, so on and so forth. You had the Duran Durans and all of them. Really, that's when they became platinum artists. They sort of set that standard. MTV really took hold of music style and the whole culture and everything. So yeah, by like 83. And so Van Halen went through, they still were hugely popular, immensely popular, but they went through a little rough period there. Not for lack of talent or writing incredible albums, because Women and Children First is, in my opinion, is an incredible album. I absolutely love this album. This is one that, I'm just going to throw it out there right like you did with the last one. I'm going to let everybody know this was a very, very close number 2. This is number 2 on my list. On certain days and certain weeks, if I'm listening to this album and I'm really in love with it at the moment, I might go, I don't know, this is my favorite Van Halen album, because it's got so much to love to it. But thinking about it, just being honest with myself, it's a very, very close number 2. First of all, again, we're getting into the side 1s and 2s. Side 1, it starts with "And the Cradle Will Rock." I mean, again, just a mammoth, monstrous, big song.
Mammoth.
Yeah, I know. And see, now I'm getting in on it too. Everybody Wants Some, Fools, and ends with Romeo Delight, which is another
and think about that. So side 1 is only 4 songs.
Right.
4 songs. Going back to, you're releasing an album once a year. It's 9 songs total. In that time, to have a 40 or a 45-minute album wasn't uncommon.
Right.
Today we're used to, a 60 or 75-minute album all the way through.
Right.
There were some limitations to the amount of music that vinyl could hold. So you're that way. At the same time, I want to go back just a little bit. You were talking about where it peaks. And, we're peaking at number 6. We're selling 3 million versus 6 versus 10 going back.
Yeah.
At the same time, we think about music today and what's on the radio. 3 years is not a long time. People are still not tired of Van Halen 1. They're not tired of Van Halen 2 because they're still being played on the radio.
Fair
so
enough.
Here's this third album that's coming out that, I think for a lot of people, it may just be that oversaturation. We've already got 2 albums. Here's a third one coming out. Oh, I got to go pick it up. It's great. But, when we think about how music was then to today, I often wonder in my mind how it would be perceived by a person of that time.
Absolutely. No, that's a super valid point. I mean, when the Van Halen 1 album came out, you're talking early 78, and the sound of it was just so revolutionary and new and different, and we were in the thick of FM radio rock time, because in that, you think about 1978, you had the other things that were just on top, which would have been, Cheap Trick, Journey with the Infinity album, Boston with Don't Look Back, all that kind of stuff. Nugent, you had all those, like that was the prime time for something like Van Halen 1 to come out. So I think that is why that just was so stunning to people. By 1980, people are still like, digesting that. They've got the 2 other albums to digest. They're still trying desperately to catch up with where Eddie Van Halen is at.
Right. And you think about the music, again, to your point of the 80s, when you've got that transition going on, you've got a lot of the first introduction to like power pop with your skinny ties and like that new wave jangly guitar rock that's taking over from disco. You've got that early 80s country, that Conway Twitty-ish kind of thing that's still kind of taking over the airwaves.
There's a lot going on at that time.
There was a lot to really dive through with all of this stuff.
Right. And sorry to cut you off, but the last vestiges of disco still.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is early 1980.
Yeah.
And I mean, disco, people like to say disco was dead by 1980, but it was still there, man. It was still hanging on, just barely. And it was morphing into something else, as was 70s stadium rock went through a little period there where it started to morph into something else, and this is the start of that morph. How many more times can I say morph?
To your point on that, one of my favorite Van Halen songs of all time, "Everybody Wants Some," is on this album.
Oh,
there's just so much to that song. Like, it's party rock, it's driving rock. There's a little bit of that breakdown in the middle, where the kooky doo loochie loo, like there's a little bit of that scatty thing that's in there. But like, once you hear that opening chord, like it was on. And honestly, there was the movie that came out, the spiritual successor to Dazed and Confused, which was Everybody Wants Some by Linklater, which, if you haven't seen it, is a great, like, 80s, not a send-up of a movie, but it's a really great homage to portions of the 80s. And, this was featured very well in it. It was a great song to use as the inspiration of that movie, so to speak.
And if we're going to be talking about movies, we have to talk about its inclusion in the John Cusack classic Better Off Dead, featuring claymation Burger singing like David Lee Roth. Side 2 of this album starts with Tora Tora, which is kind of like, it seems like a little throwaway thing, but it's literally like, oh my God, this sounds like doom death metal. Like, it sounds like something I would write for November's Doom. Like, it's so heavy. And then it goes into Loss of Control, which, again, like, you can listen to that song and I go, oh my God, this sounds like Vinnie Paul and Dimebag Darrell.
And to me, like, Loss of Control was the first song that felt like they were taking more chances. They were getting heavier and they were doing something a little bit different with it. And like, the side 2 of this is one of my more favorite side 2s, primarily because of Loss of Control. Like, when you listen to that, it's not that like party rock, let's go have some fun. Like, there's some seriousness behind that. They had range, they had variance. It was great.
It's insane. And then to think about the fact that 2 songs later, they went from Loss of Control to Could This Be Magic?
So, but in between those is Take Your Whiskey Home. And so that one, again, another acoustic tune that's very in line with Ice Cream Man, where you start with that acoustic-y kind of stuff and eventually it ends up rocking. Right. And then, you have Could This Be Magic? It's freaking bluegrass for the most part, like this like bluegrass bass kind of thing, and
slide guitar.
You want to talk, and like all the way through. At no point does it like rock up or anything like that. They just let the song exist for what it is. So you've got this super heavy, and then they come all the way back to show this acoustic side of it. And we've had conversations several times, and Adam, our drummer in Underground Prophets, has brought up Mr. Big. And To Be With You, and how you had this band that had this really great heavy side, but the first thing that they introduced was To Be With You, and the public loved that song. No other song on the album sounded like that. It was heavier and rocking, and I think that's what really kind of, like we talk about it, that's kind of what did them in. This is the exact opposite. They had already proven themselves, Van Halen, by being this great talented band that was all over the place, and then you have one super heavy song, and 2 songs later you've got this bluegrassy slide feel, and they pulled it off, and everybody fucking loved it. That's
the key part right there that's really interesting to me about Van Halen, and I was thinking about this earlier today as I was listening to them, is that it's so interesting that now people listen to Van Halen and people don't consider Van Halen necessarily to be like a heavy metal band. But back then, this was absolutely considered to be metal, hard rock at the very least, okay? And what's interesting is that guys loved this band. They didn't mind the Could This Be Magics. They didn't mind the Dance the Night Away. Like, there wasn't like this idea that like, oh, Van Halen would be cool if everything sounded like I'm on fire and stuff like that.
They fucking sold out because they're doing some bluegrass on this album. No, that
everybody
never
expected that of Van Halen, and people loved them.
It was the kitschiness, and Roth sold that. Like, he was such a goof of things. To me, he was like that late 70s, early 80s Jack Black. Like, you could put David Lee Roth in any situation and it didn't matter. He could be holding a monkey in one hand, a sledgehammer in the other, and he could have an alien riding him, on his back. Yeah. And you'd be like, oh, that's classic Roth. Look at that.
Right. Now, I will say that I do feel like as the 80s went on later, he did lose some people because he started to just get a little bit overboard with that.
He out-Rothed himself.
There was more Roth than people could handle. But overall, no, absolutely. So for me, this album, like I said, this is a close number 2. I think this is a perfect album, and the only reason that I feel like it goes just slightly behind Van Halen 2 is it's a little short. I'm done with this album. Just when I'm like ready, like I'm ready for like 2-3 more songs, it's done. And to your point, because they were cranking these albums out so quick, it's a miracle we got what we got. But still, it's a little bit short, whereas I feel like Van Halen 2 was like just about the perfect length. So this one creeps in right behind it for me. Where does this rank for you?
For me, this is number 5 out of the 7.
Wow.
But it was tough. I mean, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot, as we talk about some of the other albums that really push those albums higher. This one, for me, other than like the heaviness and that, it just didn't emotionally connect with me the ways that the other one did.
Okay.
There weren't like, to your point, I don't know that I say to your point a lot. To your point.
To my point.
To your point, sir. It was a shorter album, and I feel like there were little snippets that I liked here and I liked here, but to me it wasn't as cohesive as an album as I would have liked it to be. And I think for that it kind of falls lower on the list for me.
Yeah, I could kind of see that. I can see your point on that. Absolutely. It's not completely removed from what I was saying, but I can agree with that.
On the other hand, next up, we have Fair Warning. And I'm going to, after you, well...
Yeah, hang on. So,
next up, we have Fair Warning.
Next up, we have... Fair Warning. So Fair Warning. This is the next album. I'm trying.
No.
I don't have the zazz with this stuff. That
you're fine. So Fair Warning, released April 29th, 1981.
So again, just slightly over a year, and then once again, continuing on with the trend, not as much of a dip, but still a bit of a dip. This one only sold just over 2 million copies in the U.S.
But peaked the highest of any of them so far.
Right. So it's interesting.
At number 5.
What we're seeing here is that
the sales numbers are going down, but they're peaking higher on the charts, which is interesting because you think that those would be synonymous with each other.
Well, I think what's happening now is that Van Halen is such a popular band and they've got such their hardcore following that people are going out and anticipating the album coming out. And so they're buying it right away, which, if you get a lot of people, I mean, it happens all the time. You see bands that it's like, even nowadays, you see bands that it's like, oh, their new album came out and it charted in the first week at number 3, and 2 weeks later it's at like number 59. Like it drops really quick. And that's, again, usually just indicative of the hardcore fans went out and bought it right away.
Indicative.
Yeah, it is indicative of that. So I think that's where this is happening. Again, we're talking April 1981. They're right in the thick of that weird transitory time in the decade where we don't, some people are still yet to discover Van Halen. Some people are looking at Van Halen like that might be an old style, because now we're getting into new romantic and even early hints of hip hop, and the Michael Jackson stuff was just on the horizon. It was a weird transitory time. And so this album, I think for as long with other reasons, ended up not doing as well. And this seems to be, I mentioned it earlier, this seems to be a really controversial album. I want to throw it to you since I started with the last one.
Oh,
what
absolutely.
do you think of Fair Warning?
All right, so first let's talk about the songs around here.
Yeah.
We have Mean Streets, Dirty Movies, Sinner's Swing, Hear About It Later, Unchained, which is probably the song that most people know off of this album, Push Comes to Shove, So This Is Love, Sunday Afternoon in the Park, which is an instrumental, and then One Foot Out the Door.
Right.
So this particular album, actually, and I'll right from the get-go, this is number 4 for me. This falls flat in the middle.
Okay.
So they got a little bit more bold with this. It seems like Van Halen is pushing the limit with every album that's coming out. They're evolving, they're kind of loving the sound that they have, but they're also taking some chances with this. Sunday Afternoon in the Park, it's a very synth wave type tune. If you listen to that, it's the synth heaviest that they have gotten so far, and it's almost got a John Carpenter-esque kind of feel to it. Like you could almost take the song and throw it in Stranger Things, and it would fit in very, very well.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's one of the things that I loved about this album because it felt like that particular instrumental was a great departure from so much of the other stuff that we had heard before. That I absolutely loved it. You have Push Comes to Shove, which to me has this like Rolling Stones Miss You type feel to it. It's almost got this great like swing groove kind of to it. And you can kind of hear that inspiration from some of those classic rock bands.
Right.
And to me, it was one of the first times that while Van Halen has always been really good about putting their spin on other songs, this was one of the first albums when I'd heard it that I could actually hear inspiration from other bands in Van Halen music.
Okay.
And like I said, it could have just been the time that, I was listening to it. I'm sure that there were other inspirations, but for me, it was one of the first times that I'd kind of realized that bands influence other bands. As an 8 or 10-year-old, you don't really think about that so much as you do when you get older.
That's true.
But it was there for me. Mean Streets, just the intro on that. I mean, that's a hell of a way to start an album. And then Unchained, like that's just one of those songs, like whenever it comes on, I have to crank it up. Like it is one of the best known songs off the album, but it's that for a reason for me. So
yeah,
that's where I kind of feel about this. Like I said, I feel like they took more chances with it, and I love the introduction of the synth as part of things.
I agree with that. Okay, so this one you said was number 4.
Number 4, smack dab in the middle.
This album ends up being second from the bottom for me. This album is actually number 6. And again, folks, for people that, if there's anybody at home freaking out, being like, what the fuck? It's like, dude, I love all of these albums. Like, any of them are great. Number 6 is still amazing. But here's the thing for me with this album. Here's the great irony, is that so much of my favorite music, so many of my favorite albums, as is typical for a lot of people, tends to be the first album you got from that artist, right? Like that's how I feel about so many of them. Ironically, this was the first Van Halen album I ever got. I got this when it was new, or newish, probably late 81, something like that. Fair Warning was the first album I got, and I have to admit, while there was elements of it that I was like, oh man, this is great. Like, I loved this. There was a lot of stuff on this album that I just found myself picking up the needle and skipping over. Dirty Movies was okay, Hear About It Later is pretty cool song, but again, to me is kind of okay. Unchained is one of the greatest, one of possibly in the top 5 or at least top 10 greatest guitar riffs of all time. You pick up a guitar that's tuned to D, you automatically start playing Unchained if you know your fucking worth, man. Like, you just do that. It's one of the greatest riffs. So Unchained alone, keeps this album up there, you know what I mean? Push Comes to Shove is cool. So This Love is okay. And then the last song's like, again, a lot of, to what you're saying about a lot of the experimentation that they started doing on this album, I feel like Sunday Afternoon in the Park and then One Foot Out the Door, it's interesting. They're interesting songs. I can appreciate them on an interesting level, but they're not things that I go, you know what I feel like listening to? Sunday Afternoon in the Park and One Foot Out the Door. The whole thing with the synth, kind of fuzz synth bass. There's no rhythm guitar going on Out the Door, and until the guitar solo comes in. It's cool. I give them props for, like, hey man, 4th album, we gotta mix it up. We gotta try some other things. Blah blah blah. It just didn't quite resonate with me the way I would have hoped it would. The things that I love on this album, like Mean Street, Sinner's Swing, Unchained, I absolutely adore. Absolutely adore. There's just not, when compared to some of the other albums, there's just not enough there for me to, and so as such, kind of like what I was saying about Women and Children First, but even more so, because there's skips for me on this album, it feels just super short. It's one of those albums where I only refer to it if I'm making a playlist and I want those 3 songs or 4 songs that I feel like listening to, but this is not an album that I regularly just put on Fair Warning. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. Okay. And I feel the same way. That's why it falls kind of right in the middle for me. And again, even like, when we're talking about the scoring, that may mean that this gets like an 8.2 where my next one gets an 8.4. Like, it's so minute in the differences of how I have to rank them.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that. That's exactly right. Just because I'm putting this at number 6 out of 7 doesn't mean that this is like a
crap
like
album.
A 3 stars out of 10 or something like that. It's still awesome, but it's just not as awesome. All right, so moving right along.
Next up, we have the iconic album cover. I mean, you can see this from like across a store, anything like that. You know what this album is.
In 1982, there was many a conversion van painted with this symbol on the side.
Yes, there was.
You still, if you're in the right place.
The shaggin' wagon, yep.
I was saying, in your right place, the right time, you might still see this painted on an album. So we are into probably the most controversial album in the whole bunch, which is Diver Down. This album came out April 14th, 1982. I remember very well because I got it from the Columbia House Record Club.
Was it under your actual name and address?
Yes.
Wow.
It was. Yeah.
Wow.
I wasn't a ripoff. I used to pay for mine.
I had like 4 or 5 of those Columbia record accounts.
Oh, and it was, geez.
Yeah, no, I
had
took
one.
full advantage.
No,
full advantage.
No. I loved the record club because I got exposed to a lot of really cool things, because sometimes you'd forget to send in the card, and then you'd get the selection of the month, and I'd be like, oh,
what the hell is this?
Yeah, I didn't ask for this live Pat Benatar album, but I got it, and then I was like, well, I'm going to listen to it, and holy shit, this is a great album.
Yep.
Had that happen. Bonnie Tyler, Faster Than the Speed of Night, or whatever it was. that was one of the ones with Total Eclipse of the Heart.
I'm going to rein you back in.
Yeah, but I'm just saying. So one of the this was in April, I think it was, of 82. This was the selection of the month. And it peaked at number 3, so highest chart position. And interestingly enough, we doubled the amount of sales. This one actually sold over twice as much as the previous album. This one went over 4 million in the U.S. alone. So we're starting to see, like what we were just talking about, we're starting to see that transition and that change where the new wave of hard rock and metal and all that is starting to take a foothold with the public, and Van Halen has weathered the storm of, a lot of those other bands, your Bostons and a lot of that kind of stuff has kind of been pushed aside and forgotten, and they're not really doing anything anymore. But a couple of bands like Journey and especially Van Halen, they've managed to hang on and become part of that new sound, that new hard rock 80s thing. This is even though this is their third album in the decade of the 1980s, this is their first 80s album, I would say. And then especially by the next album, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So for me, I mentioned that this was a controversial album. The reason this album was controversial is because a little quick history about it. Van Halen were touring constantly, and the cranking out an album year after year after year was really weighing down on them by this point. People in the band were getting cranky with each other, and there was a little bit of division in the ranks about what we should be doing next, and let's take a little bit more time with that experimenting that happened on Fair Warning and everything. So they to appease the record label, they decided they were going to record a single. Let's put a single out there just to tide people over. And going to their default, they said, well, we'll do a cover so we don't have to write anything. That song ended up being their version of Oh Pretty Woman, the Roy Orbison song. Well, once the public and the label heard it, they went, oh, no, this is so good. Like, this is great, and people loved it. They're like, we need more of this.
They shot themselves in the foot by releasing the album to tide people over.
They did. So what ended up happening was the band said, well, we don't have enough time to go in and write 8 or 9 new songs. So let's do an album where we kind of go half and half, basically. Let's do pick a bunch of covers. We'll work on the covers, and then we've got a small amount of some new material that we think is strong enough we can put on there, and let's just get this out so that we can, get back on the road, keep making that money, et cetera, et cetera. And, even to this day, the members of the band have split opinions about how they feel about this album. I want to state here and now, I love this album. Again, I got it when it came out. I realize there's a lot of covers on it. I realize there's a couple things on here that are sort of like, they're They're not something, I'm not necessarily anxious to go put on Happy Trails. You know what I mean? I'm not necessarily anxious to go put on Big Bad Bill as Sweet William now. But not that there's anything wrong with those songs, but there's a few things on here that are a little bit throwaway, but the stuff that is on this album that I love, I really, really love. And this album actually ranks higher for me than Fair Warning does. This album for me is number 4 on my list. It's just after the debut album, and I know I'm probably in the minority with that. I think this is a great album, man. The Kinks cover they do, Where Have All the Good Times Gone? I mean, most people don't even know that it's a Kinks song.
I didn't for the longest time.
Yeah,
No.
and a lot of people sit there and go, oh, God, do we need 2 Kinks covers from them? Well, yeah, I think when it's Van Halen, we do, because they, even more so than You Really Got Me, they really made this one their own. It's great. Hang 'Em High, great song. Cathedral, super cool. I never knew you could use a volume control like that using reverb and volume. I mean, there have now been pedals named after that just to do that effect. Secrets is a cool song, kind of mellow song. Intruder, we're back at like what we had with Saturday Afternoon in the Park. We've got another experimental kind of thing. Oh, Pretty Woman. I mean, obviously I grew up a huge Roy Orbison fan, and while I still prefer the Roy Orbison version, I mean, the Van Halen version just rocks. That riff was just made for Eddie Van Halen. Dancing in the Street. People are really divided on this one, but I think it's great. Little guitars and everything. That I call that the Etch-a-Sketch song, right? Because in that one, Etch-a-Sketch, Etch-a-Sketch. I know that's not what he says, but when you're 9 years old and you get the new Van Halen album in 1982,
and they're rocking excellent, yeah.
To me, I couldn't remember the name of that song for the longest time when I would talk to my friends on the playground and everything. I'd be like, I like that Etch-a-Sketch song. And everybody knew what I was talking about. Of course. They understood because it sounds like Etch-a-Sketch. Anyway, and again, like I said, the other songs like Big Bad Bill, Happy Trails, and The Full Bug's a good song too. This especially I love side 1 of this album. I can listen to side 1 over and over and over again. I just love it. I get why people feel like this was a little bit of a letdown. For one thing, it's not as heavy of an album as their previous 2 albums. Fair Warning and especially Women and Children First and stuff, those were heavy albums, man. Like, for the real rivet heads that love Van Halen, like, there was a lot to love. This album, again, that's why I said this is kind of more that 80s. This is really hinting at where Van Halen is going to go in the next few years. This was the little hint there. You listen to songs like Secrets, you listen to songs like Little Guitars, and you can hear elements of not only what you're going to get with the next album, but you hear the elements of where they're going to go with their
100%
Van Hagar era. You hear that in these songs, and you didn't hear that in the previous 4 Van Halen albums. But this one, you could take a song like Secrets and wipe the vocal off and give it to Sammy and be like, sing on this, and like it would fit right into like OU812 or something like that. Like you really start to see that, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it was time for Van Halen to go that route because, again, we had 4 albums of that other sound. And, again, for me, Fair Warning was a mixed bag, Like, yeah, I love the heaviness, but at the same time, Van Halen isn't all about heavy, man, and Van Halen is about moving on. We needed a little bit of sunshine in there.
Absolutely.
And we got it with this.
For me, I'm divided by this as well. I'm divided by the album that I discovered when I was 10 or 12,
right,
and then the album that it is now. And you're right. This is the least Van Halen album of the Van Halen albums because there's 12 songs on here. Out of those 12, 5 of them are covers. 8 of them are instrumentals.
Right.
So out of that, you have 4 songs that are true Van Halen songs. Like the instrumentals are great, but most radio stations, most like house parties, they're not going to put on,
go put on Cathedral. Yeah.
You're not going to do that. So I'm very torn by that. However, that said, this is my top Van Halen album. This is my number one.
Really?
It is.
Oh, that's awesome.
It is.
That makes me really excited.
No, and again, Pretty Woman, great cover. And my memory may be fading me at this point, but in Weird Science.
Yes. It's in a version of Weird Science. They removed it later.
Yes, because of the royalties. But I remember in the very first version in the mall, when they get into the Porsche. I was so excited when I saw that scene. Yes, 100%. I love that. See, for me, side 2 though takes precedence over side 1. I grew up doing theater. So for me, I had this great hard rock and heavy metal band that was doing Big Bad Bill and Happy Trails and these like very theatrical type songs that made me love them so much more because it was the meeting of my two worlds and I loved it.
Makes sense.
If you listen to Big Bad Bill, one of the things I loved about that is, you had Ice Cream Man before. You had some of these other songs where they started acoustic and light, but they felt like they had to rock it up halfway through. They had to throw the distortion on and the heavy drums. Big Bad Bill, they left it alone. From beginning to end, it's campy and like ragtimey, and they didn't have to take it anywhere else. They let it stand on its own, and I loved it. Same thing with Happy Trails. Like, you listen to them.
I loved Happy
Michael
Trails.
Anthony, one of the best harmonizers, background singers. Like, he can fill up a song with his, and he is so underrated for it. It pisses me off sometimes because his background vocals, his harmonies are amazing. But you listen to something like Happy Trails, and it's not perfect. It is almost like these 4 or 5 guys that are just sitting around a campfire and they're just singing.
Which is what it's supposed to be.
But if you listen to some other songs, they have the ability. They could have done full harmony on that and done it perfectly, and they chose not to. And I loved that. I love that they kind of pulled back and gave the song what it needed rather than what they could produce it into being. Cathedral, again, to your point, like to hear a guitar making those sounds for the first time was like, I had to listen to that like 3 or 4 times. I'm like, what is that? There's no way that's the guitar. It can't be.
Oh yeah. I was playing guitar by that point. I was new to it, but I was already taking lessons. And I mean, hearing things like that, I just didn't even understand what I was listening to.
Yeah. Like even, like you look at the Carnal Knowledge album when he's using the cordless drill on that. Like, there was ways of taking this instrument and using it in a way that it was not known or designed to be played as, and I love that. You were talking a little earlier about this being a great lead into 1984. Yeah, if you listen to Hang 'Em High, there's some 2-hand tapping that's going on in there that you can hear an evolution of what is going to become Hot for Teacher, and those kind of things. It's like a teaser album for the next album.
That's exactly right.
But I love the covers. I love the instrumental. This one, and again, in my formative years, there was something about finding this album of that rock band that it was theater and rock and all these things, and they weren't afraid to be themselves and do what they did. Number one for that reason specifically.
That's awesome. That you might be the only person I've ever met in my life that says this is their favorite Van Halen album.
I adore it.
But I'm not complaining. This isn't my favorite, as I said. I mean, but it's right up there. It's number 4. On certain days of the week, it could be. Any one of these could be. But what a great album. I think that I really wish that people would go back and give this album a little bit more of a chance, because I know a lot of fans that say, oh yeah, I never listened to Diver Down, and I'm like, dude, go back and listen to it. Just put it on the right time, when you're cruising, it's like June and there's warm air, put it on in your car.
Yeah, it's a great summer album. And going back to what I feel conflicted about, because it is primarily a covers album and instrumental, I feel bad calling this my favorite Van Halen album because it is the least Van Halen of all the Van Halen albums based on original works in it.
Yeah, but to me, that doesn't bother me because, like I said, for Van Halen is... if this was a Kiss album and half the songs were covers, I'd be like, that's not right. If it was there's certain bands that I associate. 2 bands that I give a lot of leeway with that would be Metallica and Van Halen, because both bands are just so known for their covers and for what those songs mean to them and how they make them their own. Metallica's covers that they've done, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are Metallica songs now, so, and same with Van Halen. So I got no problem with that. That's super cool, man. All right. But moving right along here
to the best known of all of the albums.
Yeah, arguably, possibly the most successful, or at least of the Roth era. I mean, this one just about ties with the debut album. Actually, I think it even surpasses it in a few ways.
Released on my birthday, January 9th,
1984. Yeah, and this one peaked at number 2. So this was the highest charting Van Halen album to date.
And sold as much as the debut album at 10 million.
Yeah, and actually, maybe, I think at this point, I was reading something that said they think that this has probably actually sold more. A lot of these chart numbers I really want to bring up, too, are not super accurate because all these 70s and 80s albums, this was before they had SoundScan, so they're not super accurate. This is an interesting album. And
I think this is one where you and I are probably going to deviate, I think, the most out of.
Probably. So I'm going to let you run with this first.
All right. So we had how many songs? 9 songs on this album.
Yeah.
We had 1984, which leads
another
into
instrumental.
Yeah, another instrumental, which leads into Jump.
Right.
I mean, great. Talk about a great way to start an album. Jump. You got Panama. You got Top Jimmy. Drop Dead Legs.
Right. Then we
kicking
moved
off
to
side 2. Hot for Teacher.
Incredible way to start a side 2.
I'll Wait.
Yep.
Girl Gone Bad, and House of Pain.
Right.
For me, this is number 2, and
I figured it would.
Yeah,
be.
it's high, and a lot of it was their best known album. Like it was their most commercially successful album, and there are a lot of people that when you talk about the bands, oh, that's the one they sold out on, and because it's so popular, it's one of the ones I like the least. I'm not that guy. I am the general public. I like what the general public likes a lot. When we're looking at things, 1984, the way that instrumental came in, again, synthwave, like this was their synthiest album yet. And it was such a departure from the guitars. They took big chances with this and it really paid off. I mean, those first 3 songs are so synth heavy. The guitar is there, but it's supplemental. It's not competing with anything else. But I absolutely love that. Again, Jump in Panama, I will crank those every single time. There was an episode of Family Guy when they were playing Panama. I don't know if you've seen this episode, but Probably. Peter he went to the library and found out that he could rent CDs, and he rented 1984. And this entire Family Guy episode is all about how much he loves the song Panama. And at one point, he gets in trouble and he's running from the cops. And he's doing this like Thelma and Louise kind of thing where he's going to jump this gorge in this canyon. And you hear the cops going, oh man, he's going to time it. He's going to time it with the break. He's going to time it with the break in the song. And sure enough, as soon as that break happens in the song, the car launches. And they extend it out just enough to give it that like Family Guy thing. And then he hits the ground and the song keeps going. And I'm like, that is the perfect use of that song.
I have not seen that then. That's not what I was thinking.
Look it up.
I have to look that up because that's pretty funny.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then like side 2, Hot for Teacher. You want to talk about things that were done musically. You had Alex, who is playing the drums, that every single drummer I know, mine included, Adam, had learned that song. And he learned it trying to figure out how in the hell Alex is doing all this stuff. And you find out later it's overdubbed. There are multiple drum parts going on that layer it so much. And to me, you have modern drummers today who are learning it on one kit when Alex did all of these overdubs. It's amazing. That entire song, like all the way through, was the content of that song. The video made that song. My God, Carrie Ann, my wife and I joke around all the time. We're like, we're late for something. And I'm like, I don't know, feel tardy.
Yeah, right.
The little throwaway lines in that are just
Iconic
great. Like,
song.
I got my pencil. Love that.
Give me something to write on.
Give me something to write on, man. Those 3 songs, Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher, those are the ones that iconically as a general public to me define Van Halen. You don't have to know any other song, but if you know those 3, you get the feel for who Van Halen is as that general perception of, yes, there are deeper tracks and things like that, but if you want to really know and appreciate and love them, those are those 3 songs. On the flip side for me, I'll Wait is an underrated song as far as I'm concerned on this album. I absolutely love this song because, again, it is so synth heavy in that. And it's not like Jump or Panama where the synth is poppy and it's light and it's there. I'll Wait, goes into it gets deeper. It gives more of that synthwave feel that I love from Joy Division and New Order and those kind of things. The Pet Shop Boys, like, you could tell that they were also listening to what was going on with the rest of the music industry and bringing that into what they were doing. So for me, like I said, because it is such a popular album, I love it for that reason. It hit me in the way that it should have.
I have no problems with it being a popular album. It's another one. I got it when it came out. And again, is there aspects of this album that I love? Yeah. But for me, and I have to admit, it was really hard. It was just as hard figuring out what to put at the bottom of the list as what to put at the top of the list, for all the reasons we've mentioned multiple times now.
Is this at the bottom of your list?
This is actually at the bottom of my list. This is number 7. And I went back and forth about whether or not it would be this or Fair Warning. This album, I mean, Jump. I don't dislike Jump for all the, I don't dislike Jump. I know a lot of people do. A lot of people dislike Jump and stuff. Oh, it's kind of a wimpy song. I don't like the keyboards, blah, blah, blah. The keyboards are great. You know me. I love synth. I love new wave. I love all that kind of stuff. So that's not like a deal breaker for me. But Jump is just kind of, the songwriting aspect of it isn't quite what I would want, I guess. It's not enough to keep me like really engaged. Even when it first came out, I remember hearing it, and whereas like everything I'd heard from Van Halen before, whenever I heard the first song or whatever on an album, I was like, wow, and I remember hearing Jump, and I was just like it wasn't something where I ran to school the next day and was like, did you hear that Van Halen song? It was just okay. So then I was like, well, you know what? because the single came out like a couple months before the album did. I remember that very clearly. I remember seeing the debut of the video on Friday Night Videos on NBC. I still probably have that on tape somewhere. And I remember seeing it and just being like, oh, it's okay. It's all right. Well, you know what? It's Van Halen. They're all over the place. I'll wait until I get the album, and then I'll see what they've got. And it's a good album, but I think for me, because what I love about albums like Diver Down, what I love about albums like the first one, what I love about albums like Women and Children First, is I love the diversity. I love having an album that's got, On Fire as well as Ice Cream Man, or that's got Could This Be Magic as well as Loss of Control. I love that diversity. This album doesn't feature that kind of diversity. Now, they did venture into new territory with Eddie and his keys and stuff. And again, I didn't hate that. I was like, okay, that's cool. But in general of the songwriting, this became much more streamlined and more typical in ways of what we were going to see then from the Hagar era.
Absolutely. This one felt the most cohesive to me out of all the Van Halen albums.
Right. And I understand where you or other people would go, well, that's what I like about it. For me, given my tastes and what I love about Van Halen, it was that overt cohesiveness that, like, it didn't make it a bad album. I don't hate this album. I love this album overall, but
Again, it's a 6.9 versus a 7.2.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? I wouldn't even put it that low, because the things on this album that are great are great. Panama is one of my favorite Van Halen songs. I love playing it. I love listening to it, especially in the right mood. Crank it up. Hot for Teacher. Oh my God. I mean, that goes without saying. One of the best rock songs of all time. House of Pain is cool. Girl Gone Bad is cool. I'll Wait is a song that I don't dislike it. It just, even when it came out as a single, I was always just sort of like, okay, that was the other thing, because this was the second single. This came out after Jump, and I was just like, oh, okay. Like, they were really trying to push that side of it, and I admit it probably colored my overall feeling about this album. I just found myself not wanting to put this album on as much as I wanted to put on Diver Down, or as much as I wanted to put on Van Halen 2.
I think for me, that was one of the interesting things about us going through and re-listening to these, is it was so different the way that the singles were released, or what was kind of pushed on you for somebody else to want you to listen to something in a certain order, and to go back and to listen to these the way that we want to,
right?
It does definitely color the difference in that.
Sure.
And like I said, with I'll Wait, I love the style of it. When it came out originally, I was like, I don't like this as much as the other Van Halen stuff. But now, as an adult looking back at how it was influenced and how they pulled those things in, that's what I appreciate all the more.
I like it better now as an adult. I will admit that. I do feel more strongly about the album and about I'll Wait in particular. I like it much more now as an adult than I did when I was 13, 14 years old or whatever.
And to me, that's the beauty of music. And that's one of the things I love about us having these discussions is what you think is amazingly awesome at a certain point in your life when you're younger is colored a certain way. But as you grow and you learn other things and you come back to revisit these, you're like, holy crap, I see what's going on now that I wasn't aware of before.
Right.
Really cool. I think, though, that's interesting to me going into the transition to the 2012 album, A Different Kind of Truth, which, like I had mentioned to you, I completely forgot existed until we started having conversations about discussing the Roth era albums.
That's interesting.
So, I mean, this was February of 2012.
Yeah.
We had gone through all the Hagar stuff. Was this pre or post Sharon?
Oh, this was post.
Okay,
Sharon was in the band.
He did his one album.
He did Van Halen 3. That was in 1998.
Okay.
And that's a whole, we're saving that for another discussion. But, so there was a pretty long period because you figure Dave officially exited the band in 1985. He did have a brief reunion with the band back in the 90s, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally came back to the band around, I think it was around 2006. They toured for several years. At this point, Wolfgang Van Halen is now on bass, and he's also acting as a co-producer along with Eddie and everything. And eventually, they dug through a bunch of old tapes. They had some new ideas. They had a bunch of really, really old ideas. We're talking going back to the demos they made with Gene Simmons at the helm back in 1977. And they said, we've got enough here to make an album. Let's do it. And so they came out with A Different Kind of Truth. Talk about a comeback, man. Yeah, so this album ended up peaking at number 2 on the Billboard 200, though it did make it to number 1. They're finally a number 1 album for the Roth era stuff. It was number 1 on the rock charts. That's, now we've got like 50 different charts you can be on.
The adult alternative and the adult contemporary and
But so the Roth era Van Halen stuff never made it higher than 2 on the regular Billboard 200 chart. And now so we went from 1984 to 2012 and just talking about a different sign of the times. This is estimated to have sold, get this, around 500,000 copies in the United States. So, thank you, Internet and Napster and Spotify and all that shit.
Napster bad.
That's just the way it goes. Going from over 10 million copies for the last album, which was 1984, we got 500,000 for this one. But again, that being said, 500,000 is still by today's standards, is pretty good, man.
Nothing to shake a stick at.
No, exactly. And this album's also it's really hard. I want to say this is a foreign import version, we'll call it. This is really hard to get. You can't even listen to it on Spotify.
No, I couldn't find it.
Yeah, so that's not helping matters either. Matthew, what do you think of this album?
This is my lowest rated album at number 7.
Okay.
So we've got 13 songs on here. Listening to this, and again, I remember listening to this when it first came out, and maybe once or twice, and then coming back to it 11 years later. It is definitely, it's much more mature, even though it is older material. You can hear the maturity in their playing, in the singing. To me, it's the most produced album that they have put out.
Yeah.
It's the one that sounds, I don't want to say the most put together, but it is front to back. You can hear the production value has been completely raised versus what it was in 1984. And, a lot of that is just... Even
compared to the Hagar albums, I think there's a massive step up. And I think a lot of that is Wolfgang, too, because he's great.
I mean, it's well written all the way around. The storytelling, the writing of the songs, there's more age to this one, I feel. one of the things that I feel like with the guitar and the drums, when you listen to this, even though they have been playing together for years and years and years, there wasn't anything incredibly groundbreaking with the drums or the guitar. Like when you heard older albums, to me, you got a lot of that. They were trying something for the first time. This, I feel like they were a well-oiled machine that was in their groove and they were comfortable and they played that. And that's nothing wrong with that. You could hear this is a band that's been around for 30 years that knows each other really, really well. That said, there's certain aspects of it, like even with like Honey Baby Sweetie Doll, that there's a lot of rhythm and syncopation that's going that you can tell they've been playing these for a while. It had almost like an extreme type feel to it, where it's almost got that rock funk feel to it that I really liked for some of it. Stay Frosty. I love that Stay Frosty. They went back to that Ice Cream Man kind of feel to it. It's still got that it's jangly and it's fun and it's light and then it rocks back in.
Right.
But I feel, to me, like any sort of like reunion album, when you come back to it, the times have changed. 1984 was very different than 2012. And I feel like this album was done by a band from the 80s that was trying to be relevant in 2012. And I feel, to me, there were certain aspects of it that feel forced, that they were trying to capture. You've got bands like Bon Jovi, to me, is a perfect example. A band that has evolved with the time, in real time, has stayed relevant, and has had a success in every decade in very different sounds. To me, A Different Kind of Truth sounds like a band that really kind of petered out in the late 80s, early 90s, and was struggling to get that back.
Okay. I think there's a lot of people that echo your sentiment about that. 'Cause this is another one that it's very split amongst fans and everything. This album, people can guess, since this is the last one we're talking about and there's only one space left, this album was number 5. So kind of in the lower middle of my list. I have to be honest, if this album wasn't competing against the albums that it's competing against, you know what I mean? If it wasn't competing against Van Halen 1 and Women and Children First and stuff like that, I really struggled figuring out where I was going to place this, because I really, really love this album. I was not expecting much from this album when it came out. I was expecting it to be very typical of a lot of older bands' comeback albums, modern day albums. I was expecting it to be just okay, because Van Halen Van Halen 3 was just okay. Some of the latter day Sammy stuff to me was just okay. So I wasn't really expecting this to be what I got. And when I heard it, and again, the interesting thing was the first song they released from this album is the one that starts the album, and that's Tattoo. And that was such a fucking misstep, because that song is kind of terrible. It's not a good song. I think that was the one song on this album where Dave, I was trying to bring back that goofy Dave kind of kitschy, double entendre thing, this and that and all that. And it was forced. And when it comes to that song, I agree. That song felt forced, and that really got this album off on the wrong foot. And I think I still meet people that I ask them, did you ever hear this album? And they're like, oh man, I heard that song. I never I'm like, no. Fuck that song. Fuck Tattoo. Forget that. If you get the album or if you listen to it online, just skip to track 2 and go from there. Because when you get to track 2, you get to an oldie that they dug up, which is She's the Woman and everything. And it's night and day. That is classic fucking Van Halen right there. She's the Woman is great. Chinatown. Oh my God. That is one of my favorite songs. That song's so aggressive. That whole bass and guitar tapped intro thing that Wolf came up with, actually, using a capo and stuff. I think that it's something interesting and different. I love the idea that he came up with that, and he's innovative, like his father was, and everything. That song's great. Blood and Fire is great. Bullet Head is great. As is so heavy. That song is great. Out of Space is cool. Stay Frosty, like you said. There's a few things on here that it's like, if I'm not in the mood for it, I might hit the skip button. But I think this is an underrated album. And I think as far as comeback albums go, easily, to me, in the top 5 greatest comeback albums of any band ever. I Absolutely. That's why I tracked down this damn vinyl and everything. That's how much I love this album. I just think it's a great album. I understand what you're saying, and I can't even really argue with you about some of your critique of it, because it's all like pretty much correct, but it's a matter of, well, does that bother you or does that appeal to you? I don't mind that it's them trying to be more modern. I don't mind that it's lacking some of the quirks that you got with the old Van Halen, because they're, to me, I feel like I said, looking at a song like Tattoo, I feel like that's an example of why they shouldn't do that at their age.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And being number 7 for me doesn't mean I dislike this album.
No,
again,
I get it.
Yeah, you have to rank them in a certain order.
Right.
I will still listen to this, and I think it's a good album, but based on what I love about them, there's enough to pull apart here that I have to rank it where it is.
It makes sense. No, it makes sense. It's for the same reason I just said about 1984. I mean, there's some of the greatest Van Halen moments ever is on 1984, and yet it's still in last place. Right. So fair enough, man. I mean, yeah, so I think it's great, but all I know is that we've been talking for quite a while about this. We actually said we were going to make this a half an hour. Oh, that wasn't
the lies we tell ourselves.
Yeah, but here's the thing. You can't just blow through this stuff like this. It's what a catalog of music. And obviously Eddie's gone now. That's that. We're not gonna get any more.
Right.
I mean, maybe, we've got Wolf with his Mammoth project, which is awesome. I highly recommend you listen to that album. Don't expect it to sound just like Van Halen, because it doesn't. It's its own thing. But we've got other stuff, Sammy's still out there, Dave's still out there, guys are still out there doing stuff, but what we got from these 7 albums, that's it. You're never going to get that again. I should mention real quick for those that are like, oh, you didn't bring it up, you didn't talk about it. Back in the late 90s, they came out with a compilation, a greatest hits compilation called Best of Volume 1. And it had the very brief and aborted attempt at a reunion with David Lee Roth, where they did 2 new songs. They did Can't Get This Stuff No More and Me Wise Magic. Me Wise Magic was the one that got the most radio play. They're cool songs. Yeah. They're nothing that's going to knock your socks off.
But they fit well within what you expect from Roth era Van Halen stuff.
Yeah. It was an interesting time, during that time with all the guys in Van Halen. There was a lot going on, and it reflects that in those songs. So yeah, they're cool. Not really too much to say about it, but if you're a completist, then you should definitely go get that. And that's it. I mean, there's some really cool bootleg live. I've got some awesome bootleg live vinyl of Van Halen from like Manchester 78, and I've got a great 1984 tour bootleg that you would probably love, man. Like there's stuff like that to seek out. Great video. Like you mentioned videos. I mean, Van Halen were a little late to the game. They didn't make their first official concept video until they made the goofy Pretty Woman video for Diver Down in 82. But then after that, they produced some of the most iconic Jump video, Panama video, Hot for Teacher video. These are, iconic. So, you can look for that stuff. We're going to talk about music videos. We're really delving into the music stuff now. We've been threatening it for 5 years, and
and it's happening, damn it.
It's happening.
Happening right now.
We're making it happen. So we've got so much stuff, I'm sure we'll be talking about Van Halen.
Well, for sure. And we've talked about it too. I am much more of the Hagar camp than I am the Roth camp. So we're going to be doing a part 2 to this, where we're dissecting all of the Hagar stuff and what they brought to the table and how things evolved from there. So I know that you guys probably have a lot of opinions on everything that we've just shared.
Oh, yeah.
Stuff we got right. I'm sure you think we got a lot of stuff wrong. I really want to know what you guys think. So leave us some comments. Let us know.
Like, share, subscribe all that kind of stuff. And let us know, anything you want us to talk about. It doesn't have to be about Van Halen. It could be about any kind of music stuff. We want to hear from you. We've got more coming soon. So see you then.
Rock and roll. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.